Welcome, ladies. Welcome to this Imperial Sunday. Imperial because this Sunday marks the 344th year since the death of Zhou, the Shangzhen Emperor, which was the last of the Ming dynasty in China, the last of the ethnically Chinese Han dynasty in China. And we're talking about China today because Hazzikostas, the lead game designer for World of Warcraft, released an interview on Douyu, which is, the Twitch TV of China. In this interview, he actually answered to a few interesting questions. I always mention this. The interviews from the Chinese sites, even from BlizzCon, were actually more interesting than the shill questions offered by the Western interviewers, the paid-off crooks, slaves of Blizzard. So we do have some interesting questions being posed to Ion, and let's go and see exactly what type of answers he's giving. Now, Ion in interviews is known to be a sniveling, slimy creature. Very difficult to cage him into giving an actually real and sensible answer. So let's see if in China they were able to get something out of him. Now, a good part of the questions were posed towards Mythic Plus, of course being one of the most represented types of activities in the game, and particularly after the announcement of Blizzard that they were going to add a Raider IO style system, point system, for Mythic Plus. Now, one of the questions is based on rewards. Let's start with this one because I made a video about this as well, after the announcement that Blizzard was going to add the teleports for being able to complete a key at plus 20 difficulty. So the question is, yeah, sure, we get the teleports for plus 20s, but what about something else? There is no other special reward for pushing high keys. Since there will be an official ranking system for the Mythic Plus in the future, no longer tied to a third-party system, to a third-party site like Raider.io, maybe award the high-ranking team with some title, maybe some transmogs, some better rewards for high keys. The answer is yes. It's amazing to see, the community is embracing the whole Mythic Plus competitiveness. And yes, we do want to have some high-end recognition in the same way that in PvP, the very, very top players can have Sinful Gladiator, or in raids, players can have Hall of Fame. So we do agree that Mythic Plus should have something similar. Another interesting question for Mythic Plus was focused around the disparity between melee and ranged DPS. As you know, because you watch me, I pointed out that in BFA, melee DPS, while not being more popular than ranged, in raids, at the very least, they had their Mythic Plus escapade, where they were more popular, more represented than ranged DPS. In Shadowlands, though, we also had a turnover there as well, because ranged DPS became more popular in Mythic Plus in Shadowlands as well. So melee DPS were getting pushed out of PvE content, and the question was essentially, we are all curious about what the fuck was the dev team thinking when they came up with stuff like Storming and Spiteful? How could it have possibly ended in any other way other than annoying melee DPS much more than ranged DPS? Ion here is very elusive, as usual. It's something we're actively discussing for Season 2. We have already made some changes. Hopefully they can be less punishing for melee, but we agree that between several different affixes, ranged DPS don't have to worry as much as melee. There should be a better balance of affixes there, and we are looking specifically at the design of our newest affixes, Storming and Spiteful, for Season 2. Very elusive, very up in the air, very smoke and mirror here. Not really any real answer. Now, another interesting question, which I'm sure more people are interested in, is because this is something that we have heard before, even before we had any news about the whole ranking system for Mythic Plus being official, made by Blizzard. The question about matchmaking, the question about being able to pair people together or match 5 people together for a Mythic Plus key. Now, before the answer that would shut down this question is, how do you pair them together? Blizzard is not going to use a third-party site like Raider.io to match people. So if I want to run a plus 19, how can I be matched with someone who has only run plus 7? It doesn't work. You need a ranking system, a rating system, but Blizzard doesn't have a rating system. They have a framework. You can go on a guy's armory and look at the highest keys he completed, but not much else, not much more. How many of them has he completed? Which role did he completed them in? What's the rating? There isn't one. Blizzard just has the basic, but needs to implement, needs to get more. So the question, of course, is, okay, now that there is going to be a ranking system, will there be a matchmaking system for Mythic Plus? Since you can rate them, since you can rate their level, then you can also match similar level players through a built-in ranking or scoring system and do Mythic Plus together. Now, Ion gives an interesting answer. Even though you might still think it's elusive, it's inconclusive, the answer is this. The big concern with matchmaking is that WoW is, unlike other games where matchmaking is very common, like Overwatch, like MOBA games, like League, you might play different champions, different heroes, you can go for a different build, for a different strat. In WoW, you are your class, you are your spec, there's not something you can change. And the composition matters tremendously for group success. So if we randomly match you with teammates that don't seem like a good combination of classes, or who you would prefer, I don't know that's going to be the most fun experience. And so we prefer to give players control over who they group with. So yes, he does say that we think that there is a lot of things that they can do on the group finder to improve it, like making it easier to do it without add-ons required, third-party add-ons, to see the rating, the experience, being able to search in the group finder for specific dungeons, for difficult key levels, specify if you just want to finish the dungeon or if you're looking to push the key, what type of group, composition, etc., you're looking for. However, there is the problem of, the meta. And this was something that comes very often up from Blizzard developers. Is not something that Blizzard can change, the perception of the player base. You do say you want the matchmaking, right? And you are, let's say, a normal meta spec like a Fire Mage. What if you queue up through the Mythic Plus matchmaking system and you get matched with a Blood Death Knight, a Mistweaver Monk, an Enhancement Shaman, and a Demonology Warlock? Technically, they have similar score as you do. Technically, they should be invited similarly to how you have been invited to a key, right? The reality is that you, the Fire Mage, would have gotten invited much more likely to a key than a Demonology Warlock or an Enhancement Shaman. But because the matchmaking system doesn't have any prejudices, any discriminations towards non-meta specs, you ended up grouped up with them. So the point of Ion is that the matchmaking system is going to be pretty good for the underrepresented specs, because they get to play, finally, they get to be invited by an AI. No longer do they get to be ignored by the players, but then all the other players who don't want them are gonna end up being matched up with them. So that was his sort of explanation as to why the matchmaking system is a little bit sketchy to be implemented in Mythic Plus. Now, the last of the interesting answers for Ion when it comes to Mythic Plus is the one regarding the scoring system and how it's gonna work. Now, he doesn't actually give you a proper answer, of course. He says, we are still working on all the details, we want to iterate it on the PTR and see how it goes. But honestly, for those who are familiar with Radar.io, it's basically going to be similar. The idea is a base score per dungeon, based on the level you completed it, with a small bonus if you completed it well ahead of time. That is just the norm. The addition, though, the special ingredient put in by Blizzard, seems like it could be that they want to add separate scores for doing it on Tyrannical and on Fortified, to encourage players to complete both versions as opposed to just pushing on Fortified week and going to sleep on a Tyrannical week. There is different types of skill sets, of pathing, of strategies required for both, so they want to make it clear that maybe one player is better at one type of dungeons, Fortified, or the other, Tyrannical. And then also they can use this system to tie it into things like Valor Points, achievements, Keystone Master, or Keystone Conqueror. Essentially, rather than just being an achievement that says, do all dungeons at plus 10, do all dungeons at plus 15, it can be something more flexible, like achieve this amount of rating. For example, you can achieve this amount of rating, which equals doing all dungeons at 15 without actually doing all dungeons at 15. Maybe you have a couple at plus 14 and a couple at plus 16, which evens out at allowing you to get the achievement without getting all at plus 15. Now, of course, the answer sounds pretty interesting when you think about it, to having different ratings based on the affix. The problem is, and this is pretty fitting because we had a video yesterday about Tyrannical. I didn't know anything about this interview yesterday, but it's very fitting because the problem remains, of course, that yes, it can be an incentive to get people to do more Tyrannical keys because now they have to get a different rating than Fortified. However, Tyrannical is still annoying. Tyrannical is still oppressive, Tyrannical is still more frustrating because of the affixes Tyrannical can get. And right now, as we just heard, there isn't any clear, defined extra rewards being given to you in Mythic Plus. So effectively, you would just have to run every dungeon twice as much to get the same rating that you used to get in Radar.io. If you have all dungeons done at plus 17, in 9.1, to get to the same level, you have to do them twice. Once in Fortified and once in Tyrannical, which is going to be pretty annoying if there is no extra reward. If the only reward is that you have to do it to push your rating, it's not going to be enough. People are going to be frustrated at that. Now, after the Mythic Plus part, we go into the class balance, the class design, the meta part of the interview. Now, one of the interesting questions is about group buffs. The question is, why do warriors have Battle Shout? Why do priests have the Fortitude stamina buff? Yet, Many other specs are without their buffs. They have been taken away doing the big pruning of Worlds of Draenor. Druids have lost Gift of the Wild. DKs have lost Horn of Winter. You used to have Smoke Bomb for rogues. A whole plethora of things that are now gone. Well, the answer is a pretty quick shutdown by Ion. We are not currently planning on giving everybody a buff. One of the challenges here is we want classes to feel a bit different from each other, and when everyone has something, yes, it's cool to be a part of that ceremony of seeing all the buffs go on before you pull the boss, but at the same time, it can start to feel kind of too much. So we want every class to have some unique benefits and reasons why people in your group and raid are happy to see you there. But that is not always going to come in the form of a passive buff. Now, of course, after Ion says this, you obviously go into your raid and you ask yourself, what exactly is a rogue bringing to this raid again? I forgot. Now, of course, this can frustrate some people. It is undeniable, for example, that several melee DPS and by extension tanks are being chosen based on what they can bring and give to the raid. The only reason why recently you had Havoc Demon Hunters in a raid is because they give you a raid debuff in case you don't have a Vengeance Demon Hunter. The only reason why you would have a Protection Warrior as a tank is if you don't have Warrior DPSers, so you need your Shout for attack power, even maybe your Rallying Cry. And if you don't have a Protection Warrior, which is much more likely, then you will want a Fury Warrior for the Shout. Similar thing can be said for bringing a Brewmaster Monk tank. There is nothing wrong, in fact it might even be preferred to bring something like a Guardian Druid tank. But if you don't have a Mistweaver, because Mistweaver is very unpopular, if you don't have Windwalker, because Windwalker is also pretty unpopular, despite not being bad, it's just not played a lot, then you do want a Brewmaster Monk tank because of the debuff they can bring. So yes, even though every spec shouldn't really give you buffs and whatnot, there are some cases where raid spots are decided based on this. Not really any other power being brought by the class or the spec being different than another spec. It's just the special thing they have, which can come out to be frustrating, like a Retribution Paladin having to be benched because the fellow Fury Warrior has a Shout, has a button they can click before a pull, and that's what keeps them into the raid, while he has to be benched. That doesn't feel good. Then there was another question about balance, which was already asked, so this was pretty important to them, which was the question about melee and range DPS. This was asked in the Mythic Plus portion and comes up again in the balance portion. The balance between melee specs and range has been always controversial. No matter if it's a boss or a dungeon mechanic or a seasonal affix, it seems like the dev team favors range specs more than melee. Ion admits a moment of weakness. Ion admits this is something that the class design team talks about a lot. We want melee and range to have advantages and disadvantages, and I think it's natural when the obvious strength of the range DPS is, you can stand at a distance, you're much less vulnerable to several mechanics, also because you can move, and at the same time you can continue your DPS rotation while moving, compared to a melee DPS. So we do a mea culpa. We admit that there is more that we can do in terms of class mechanics and how we approach the design of our encounters, so that there is going to be more situations where you are happy to be in melee, where the hardest part of the mechanic, the hardest part of the encounter is going to be on the range DPS. We don't want it to always be equal. This is pretty important. We are happy to go back and forth between who gets shafted in each encounters or maybe keys in Mythic Plus, but we do agree that right now melee are probably suffering more than they should be. I would say a little bit longer than right now and a little bit more than they should be. I think it's a pretty big problem. At least you do have an acknowledgement. That's, I guess, how far Ion can go in this type of interviews. And then as the last one of these type of questions, we have an interesting one. We have a pretty unique type of question, which is, what do class designers or the Blizzard balancing team look for when they are balancing classes? Is it the feedback from the players in the forum? Is it third-party websites like Warcraft Logs or Raider.io? Or does the designer team personally go in and play the classes to see what exactly the problem is? Now, Ion says it's basically all of these things. The designers are not going to play to see if it's weak. They're going to play to see if it feels bad, if the rotation feels bad, if it feels clunky, if it feels like slow or just not feeling well to play. But in terms of balance, then we obviously look at numbers. And if we have to look at numbers, then our own internal data matches a lot of what the community can already see. Because at the end of the day, the community is looking at Warcraft Logs and the representation in Raider.io, which is basically very similar to the numbers we have. Warcraft Logs and Raider.io are taking things from the Blizzard's API. It's very similar numbers to what Blizzard already has. So there is no secret type of observation that Blizzard has that is obscure to anyone else. Maybe Demonology Warlock is actually the strongest spec in the game and nobody has realized it yet, and Blizzard just is not saying anything to see if we figure it out. It's not like that. And then he harkens back to what I pointed out about the feel of the community, the perception of the community. That is what raid leaders and pug leaders use to decide who do they want to invite to their groups. At the end of the day, if the community thinks that a spec is not good and they don't want to bring them to groups, it does not matter what our data says internally. We need to work to change what the community perception is, because otherwise people who play that spec can't play the game the way they want to. They can't fight groups and they can't have a good time. Which is of course true. There are several specs that can do perfectly fine all the way up to plus 20 keys, even plus 21, and yet they are getting gated out of 12 keys or 14 keys. That has nothing to do with balance, it has nothing to do with the spec being underpowered. It's just that people see specs being very good, played by top players, and they assume it is the same for them, much lower down the ranks. You have seen this before in other games. If you've ever played Dota or League, normal scrubs taking the opinions of pro players and then applying them to their own shitty games is not the same thing. The last part of the question is related to things like catch-up mechanisms, the rewards, and the legendaries system that is going to be changed in 9.1. One of the questions is, interestingly, because I didn't think it would have been an issue, but is related to the Great Vault. Many players feel like the bonus roll still beats the Great Vault, allowing players to pick one item out of 9 possible options versus, re-rolling, having the chance to get an extra piece of loot 3 times a week from the bonus rolls. Ion here is pick elusive. He basically doesn't give an answer related to whether or not they are thinking about bonus rolls and whatnot, since there was also a data mine string for 9.1 with something that could be hinting towards the bonus rolls making a comeback. And his answer is very elusive. The only thing he points out is, for sure, we think we can do better with the fallback reward. We don't think that the Stygia we are currently rewarding feels satisfying enough. Because, of course, in past expansions, the fallback reward was artifact power. So at the very least, you could still get something that could empower your character, whereas nowadays, Stygia, it's not that important. I am more surprised that there are people that don't like the Great Vault. Maybe you can not like the Great Vault in a vacuum on its own as a standalone system, but you have to compare the Great Vault with the Mythic Plus cache, the weekly random cache from BFA. Even compare it to the Mythic Plus cache plus the bonus rolls. I still don't think it's too much of a difficult comparison. I think the Great Vault wins easily. Of course, if you do 1 Mythic Plus every week and you kill 3 bosses and you get 2 options, then yeah, it's probably worse, but at least it's a fair type of worse because it's based on how much you're playing. Then there is a couple of questions related to alt friendliness to finish out the interview, as well as the covenant system. One is that it's hard to not notice that the current gameplay of an alt character is not that friendly to have. Players have to go through the repeated covenant quests, the campaign, the farming the anima, the doing the more quests on your alts, not even mentioning the fact that you have to take 5 weeks for an alt character to upgrade their legendary from level 1 to level 5 because of Soul Ash. Is there going to be more alt friendliness in 9.1? Yes. Okay, we are starting well. Yes, Chains of Domination will definitely add a lot of catch-up mechanisms, both for alts but also for returning players, for new players who are joining Shadowlands and hitting level 60 for the first time as well. It's going to be much more important for you to be able to get into the new content, to get a legendary without having to wait weeks for it, so that you can play with your friends and experience what everyone else is doing. So that will benefit both new and returning players, so alts as well. This is the straightest answer that Ion has given all interview. It is also not that new for a new patch to add catch-up mechanisms for the previous patch content, right? It's not something that out of line. The last question is related to covenants. In Shadowlands, each class can pick 1 out of 4 covenants at a time. Many players felt that the limit of switching covenants greatly weakens the gameplay of each class. Some class can only play 1 spec due to their covenant choice, because if they switch specs, then they also have to change the covenant because the covenant is no longer the best one. Will there be more freedom of switching covenants in the future? No. Just as he was straight in the answer about alt friendliness, he's also pretty straight in this answer. Unfortunately, I have to say that we don't currently plan on making it easier to switch. The current system where you can switch relatively straightforwardly, but if you want to go back and forth, there is a quest line and cooldown between them, is likely to remain. So you still have a freebie switch from all the 4 covenants from one to the other for relatively free, but then if you want to go back, it's going to cost you. The thing is that we are most interested in hearing feedback on more and more of the situation when you feel like you're locked into one choice for one spec and a different one for another. We made a lot of changes in the recent 9.0.5 patch to improve the balance between the different covenants. But we know we have more work to do there, and that's something that we want to continue to work, blah, blah, blah. And maybe one is slightly better or slightly better there, but you never feel like you have to be this or you have to be that, etc., etc., etc. True, they tried to add a few of these things in 9.0.5. Doesn't seem like there has been too much of a difference. Many of the covenant main picks for pretty much many of the specs have remained the same. We did get a few changes, Assassination rogues are going more Ventir. It is possible that balanced druids might be going Kyrian in 9.1. There is also likely the change for warlocks, as well as we had previously the one for priests, but not that many. I guess I was wrong. I thought going deeper into the expansion, we would have gotten closer to an amalgam of all covenants. We would have gotten closer to maybe even a dual spec of covenants, being able to just roll between a couple of them, but doesn't seem like it's going to be the case, at least for the entirety of 9.1. Maybe something closer, something into 9.2, but looks like not for now. Now, these were all of the more interesting bits of the interview. I'm going to leave you behind the actual link to the actual interview if you want to watch it for yourself, although it's just completely dubbed in Chinese. It's just subtitles for you to read, so I'm also going to leave behind the transcribed interview if you want to read it all, including some other useless questions like the special pets for BM Hunters or the third spec for Demon Hunter class or Ember Court for the Ventirs being too hard, and these type of pointless things. In general, I think the rest of the questions were pretty good, pretty interesting. Now, we can stop here now because I have to leave. I have to go and actually buy some ice cream. It's a very pressing matter. Thank you for watching the video. Remember that if you want to tell me which flavors of ice cream I should buy, you have to subscribe first. Otherwise, you have no right. See you guys soon, probably tomorrow. And in the meantime, the only flavor that can't be moved is pistachio.